Hello, Adrian here. So we are now going to sort of dive in even further down the rabbit hole of what exactly each of these objects that we've been dealing with Unreal actually function. And one of the things we sort of tiptoed around but really haven't looked into in depth is why is it that within details there's sort of all this information being attached to objects. So within something like Rhino, usually all you can attach is like the sort of material that something is, maybe a name, but not much else. This transform information really isn't stuck to it. It's more just the quality of the object, and you're able to do a lot of things within that. But what this really means is that this is not the geometry in itself. This object that we see in here, cube 2, this guy, let's rename him maybe. Let's just double click on him to rename him since we haven't really gone through that. So let's call him a bucket, because that's what it functionally is. And so within this bucket, Unreal doesn't really care what's inside this bucket. The name that's on there, even though it says cube, it doesn't have to be a cube. It's just its identifier to Unreal. And so because of that, we can go over to here and we'll see the static mesh that's actually inside this bucket of information. And we can do a couple of things with this. So the first thing is that we can actually navigate to where this bucket is. And that's within this sort of basic shapes area. Just as a note, this folder you might not have seen before because it's not usually accessible, and it's the engine content. Don't touch anything in there, because the engine content is actually the sort of core of Unreal, and if you edit anything in the engine content, it'll knock on that effect to every file you make in Unreal. And the only way to undo that is to literally delete and re-download Unreal. So if you're going to edit any of these, the best practice is to actually drag them and copy them into, so I'm just going to dump them into our imports folder, and I'm going to copy them there. And that just makes sure that whatever you do to those objects doesn't break the rest of your model. So we have our objects in here amongst all of our other elements. And so what I can do is, I can do two things. I can, within the static mesh, if I want to change what mesh is being referenced here, I can just click on the little name of it, which has this drop down. This one's not as easy to sort of go through because you can search for things directly, but you might not remember everything that's in there. So what I'm going to do is either drag and drop. So instead of dragging, for instance, the cone into our world space, I'm going to actually drag it into the static mesh. And you'll see that that actually appears in the place of the cube. And that's because the cube is actually just a figment of our imagination. No, I'm kidding. It's actually a representation of the asset that we have in the content browser. So when we, for instance, change the location, which is kind of an easy one to get your head around, so I can just drag this guy over here. But if we change the rotation of this and also the scale and sort of stretch it out a bit, so, that's a bit too big. Let's unlock the uniform scaling so we can stretch this out a bit just to get an idea. That's a bit too far. Let's make it just 3 times. So I'm going to just type in 3, press enter, stretch that out. If I dump now a cylinder in here, the cylinder inherits that transformation. So all of this information that's in the details is being applied to sort of this bucket and making an object. So it's more like the instructions for making an object. So it applies a transformation, it applies a material. And likewise, if we click this, this browse for asset to the material, well, that's not the material we want, but that'll show you where the material is. But if we go into our starter content, find one of the fancy materials in the materials browser, and just drag that on. Or if we click, for instance, on gold, because we want a blinged out cylinder, we can click on that and we click on this little arrow, and that'll immediately apply that material to it. And that's just handy for sort of as a bit of a shortcut. And now we have this blinged out cylinder. And so all of this information that's in here is what is this actual object? Like, this object is this information. So that's why when you delete things within the content browser, it'll delete, the object will actually stay there. So I'm just going to demonstrate some bad practice, which is I'm going to click on this object, scroll up to the cylinder, and I'm going to first just save all. So good practice, save all, bad practice, delete this object. And I'm going to force delete this. So I'm not going to replace it, I'm just going to force delete, and it's going to pop out of existence. But what you'll notice is that the bucket's still there. And that's because the bucket doesn't care if there's no mesh that's inside it. It'll still live on without it. And so we can now drag a cone and put it back in, and it'll remember everything still. And it'll put a little materials thing back in. So the buckets remain there regardless of if you delete things, because that information is its own object, is the object. what's in the content browser is just getting hosted into this bucket. So be aware that that's how Unreal operates, and that all of the properties that you're applying to objects for the most part are going to be applied through this dialog. It will inherit certain things from the asset viewer, which we're going to be covering in a second. But for the most part, you're going to be applying a lot of this yourself just by moving things around, scaling them, and sort of attaching things to one another. So that's the basics of what buckets are and how objects really exist in Unreal. So thanks for watching. Remember to save everything, because otherwise you'll sort of be sad at yourself because you'll lose all that information. And we'll see you in the next video.
This project was supported by a UTS Widening Participation Strategy, First Year Experience Grant, funded through the Australian Government Higher Education Participation and Partnership Program. The videos were produced by Matthew Austin and Adrian Taylor.